Okay. Uh, I have the pleasure of standing in front of you, everyone, today, and I would like to talk about a brief, you can say, interesting framework, which I have come to find in terms of the market cycles. And what I can describe it is kind of the underlying forces behind any price action. So before that, my name is Omar Almahmoud, and I'm the CEO of the ICT fund, which is a government fund here based in the UAE. And also I'm a member of the Foundation for the Study of Cycles. But before that, I'd like to ask that there's a question, and what if I told you if the markets before that, what if I told you if the markets are actually not random or they're not irrational, but there's an underlying rhythm which one can actually deduce. And I'll explain to you the framework today, what I've come in terms of conclusions. But in terms of my day-to-day job is I'm the ICT fund CEO, which is a 1% revenue of the telecom operators in the UAE, as well as, for example, the technology, you can say, catalyst in the UAE, such as, I presume if you are a UAE citizen or a resident, you may have UAE Pass in your phones or in your pocket today. It's one of our flagship investments. We're also the investor behind the space program here in the UAE. And recently, we've been in partnership with NASA to build the Moon Gateway, which is the next ISS that humanity is embarking on. I'm also an avid cycle analyst, as well as a researcher and a member of the foundation based out of the US. Cycles are all around us. Cycles exist in this photo. There's the cycle of the Earth around the moon, the cycle of around the sun, and the moon around the Earth on its axis, as well as the cycle of the clouds going around and the seasons, and then oceans as well. Your breathing is a cycle, your heartbeat is a cycle. You have cycles everywhere around you, and they can be, you can say, recognized, and actually you can more or less identify where the beginning of a cycle starts and ends. Of course, there are multiple cycles in different avenues, such as in the US elections, you have the presidential cycle, which is a repeated pattern, which one can actually use to identify where we are in terms of the cycle. So this 4-year cycle can actually start, and then it runs up all the way to the 4th year of any presidency that the US has. And these are the results which one can actually use to identify the market cycle. You also have long-term generational cycles, which are 45 to 60-year cycles, such as the contractive wave cycle or a technology generation cycle. And we're on the precipice of one, which is on the AI cycle. So every you can say 45 to 60 years, we have a long-term generation cycle, which changes the paradigm of any industry. There's also the well-known, of course, Bitcoin halving cycle. And of course, this is a very well-known, I'm not going to delve too much into this. And of course, on a macro level, you have Ray Dalio and his you can say proposition about the changing world order, or the empire cycle, or a macro historical cycle. And if you wish, you may read the Changing of World Order, the book which he is currently selling. So there are 3 different lenses. One can actually analyze the markets, of course, quantitative and fundamentals and technical. And when it comes to fundamental, if you open up CNBC or Financial Times or think of Warren Buffett, it's primarily about fundamentals, such as you can say earnings and ratios. So quantitative is a more, you can say, scientific drive in terms of how do you identify cycles. So this would, for example, is Jim Simmons and his Medallion Fund, which was one of the most successful funds. He was a mathematician, and this mathematician actually read the book called Solve the Market. He earned 66% since 1988, 2018, and he passed away last year. What the book talks about is basically the hidden markup model, which is basically a model which one can use to identify probability of states between moving states, such as like if it was sunny today, tomorrow it's going to be cloudy, or the day after there's a probability of it being rainy. And then you would generate a matrix. But there's also the hidden version of it, which is you could say identify or correlate different phenomena related to those states. Say if you are stuck in a room and you don't know what the weather is, but you would identify the weather outside by the clothing of the people who are visiting you. So that's just an example of an analogy of how one can actually build a model, and thereon you can say identify the probability of what the market would look like. Of course, technical analysis, I'm not going to bore you with this, you can say crazy, you can say technical overkill, which a lot of, you can say YouTube gurus are out there are claiming that this indicator works better than this and so and so. But there is also something called market, what I coin, or Mr. Stan Harley coins, part of the foundation, is kinematics, is like, how do you identify the price movement without actually necessarily knowing the fundamentals, or if there's a quantitative model or whatsoever? Or in short, is there a mathematical equation to the market? So for a piece of information to be very useful or desirable, one has to ask, like, what sort of criteria should it meet? Well, Howard Marks, Oaktree Capital, was in discussions with Warren Buffett, and Warren Buffett told him, well, it has to be, first of all, it has to be important in the first place, and then it has to be knowable or more or less actionable if a piece of information is to be desirable. And with that said, so I actually embarked on a journey of how do I basically come up with an equation for the market. And what I did is I had a math professor who was a world-renowned professor in elasticity. He came up with a solution to composite materials in terms of how do you define its elastic equations. And inspired by his equations, and he solved an open equation, is what I did is I took this analogy, is that can we describe the price action of any asset in the market or globally, and look at it as if it's an elastic material, and then come and use those materials, you can say Young's modulus, for example, and use that to define the price action, if it's elastic enough, and where's the deformation point, and then where's the breaking point. So I came up with 3 different variations of those modules, and I called them the financial modulus. Some are based on volume, some are based, for example, on volatility and VWAP. In short, it doesn't work. So moved on to a different model, which was, if material science as a basis doesn't work, then probably I'm not looking at the right science domain. And then there was an engineer called J.M. Hurst, and he came up with a full cyclic framework based on engineering, or more or less physics. And to make it easier for you, it's based on the sine wave, if you wish. So what is a cycle? A cycle, of course, could be described as a circle, or it could be described as a sine wave on a y to or an x to y axis. And of course, you can always calculate the trough or the peak of the cycle. But what I want in terms of the results is that there are multiple cycles, or infinite number of cycles, that are going on at any given time in any market. And what you can actually see here is you can say the translation of the price action, where each of the underlying smaller cycles result in a trough in the price action. And then the question is, okay, what happens to these intersecting cycles? Well, they're synchronized. If you identify the point of the bottom of one singular cycle, you're probably, you have a clue of where you are at in terms of the rest of the cycle. So there's always a point of synchronization in terms of the troughs, but never at the peaks. And there's also a harmonic nominal model where Hurst actually over a period of 50, or data over a period of 50 years, actually came up with a nominal model that this model stands for all assets. These cycles exist for all assets, and you can use them to identify where you're at in terms of the cycle. But there's also a ratio between them. So there's a 2-to-1 ratio in most of the cycles, except for a couple of few which have a 3-to-1 ratio in between them. And there's also this major principle I would like to emphasize, which is the principle of variation, that these cycles do not have fixed, they have an average length, but they're always vary due to the nature of the market conditions. So in terms of the principle of variation, one must always, you can say, have that variation constant added to this equation. So how does one actually deduce where the cycles are at? One can use, for example, visual transformation. You can identify the cycles visually on a chart, or you can actually use Fourier transformation to identify which cycle has the most heartbeats in any given underlying asset. So here's an example of you can say a cycle assessment where the market was, you can say, you can describe it, but you can actually see that the peak is never at the top of the arc, where there's always an offset of sorts, where one can actually use to identify where we're at in terms of the peak. Other assessments, And you can use them, for example, to identify where we are at in terms of the current Bitcoin cycle. And last but not least is what I'm working on in terms of research is like, when we describe the nominal model, this is a problem of averages, and you should never settle for the average or the base model, because there's always a variation as based on the principle of variation. And also most cyclic analysis are also concerned specifically about timing the market. Whereas it's not just the x-axis one should be interested in, but actually the y-axis, where one can actually identify based on different metrics what would the peak be or what the peak would top at in terms of the price action. Thank you so much. I hope I enjoyed the talk. Okay, so just to understand the question, you're asking any guidance in terms of using the markup model or the hidden markup model. Well, the issue is you would have is when you would face, or if you were going to use a hidden markup model, what sort of observed phenomena you would use to identify what. There are so many metrics in terms of correlation. So let's say if you take BTC, what sort of correlated phenomena would you observe to build that model? And that, I think, is the major problem. And that's why I'm not using quantitative assessment to identify this. And that's why I moved on to using existing equations such as Young's modulus when I started out with the material science module. And then Hurst actually came up with the sine wave to use as the basis of model. But hidden markup models, you would have the challenge of identifying what observed phenomena is correlated or has enough correlation to the underlying asset.